Namaste all, and welcome to Evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste, Narad, and welcome to all.
Today we are going to have Learning on the Way, Part 2, with quotations from Record on Yoga and also related questions. Please begin.
Thank you, Narad. Yes. Last time I had shared some early experiences which were shared with two intentions. First, to show how certain things can develop, and with the hope that it will be helpful to others who go through similar kinds of experiences. And the second is to show how certain forms of experiences specific to a type can take place, or perhaps things I've learned over the years, having gone through many mistakes, would be helpful for others to avoid those mistakes, or if passing through those mistakes, give them a reference. So these are useful, especially when it concerns experiences, because there is very little literature out there to guide us in this way. The only literature we have in the spiritual domain where there is literally a day-to-day diary is from Sri Aurobindo. And then from the mother, there is the prayers and meditations, which were quite extensive and in fact were day-to-day diary notes, of which at a certain point, unfortunately, the bulk of them she separated and gave to destroy. And they were burnt, unfortunately. But had they survived, they would have made an exceptional record in her sadhana. And in this particular context, Sri Aurobindo's record of yoga helps us to see the rapidity and pace at which the integral yoga can actually form and develop in us. It gives you the reference of his own pace, but also the precision, the depth, the accuracy with which he jots things down shows you that the yoga is not a fanciful, vague, abstract domain of ideas of spiritual, again, vague, non-material experiences. That's how people see spirituality. They are in fact extremely precise, very tangible, and with clarity and discrimination that can be even more exacting than that of the intellect. We have looked at some examples from his record of yoga already, and we will look at something far more later, more developed, more in his later stages of the sadhana. But I had used some of my experiences last time as a point of access, which many could relate to, and for many it would be a useful starting point. I propose today to continue something along these lines with a few more examples of things which might be again relevant and useful. But first, I want to take up a question which came from Jose. He writes, born in 1976, in his early 20s, I had opportunity to live in North India for 2 years in one of the Mothers and Sri Aurobindo centers with my young wife and first son of 4 years. And then he says, while reading Savitri, he heard the name Sri Aurobindo was enough to take the crazy. For him, it was enough to take the crazy resolution to go to India as a young couple and a baby. And after 20 years of contact with this, I would say only till 2023, my sadhana has been activated more powerfully and was reinfused as I was able to visit Pondicherry for the golden day of 2024, having Savitri at my side every day. And Mothers and Sri Aurobindo's presence is strong today, and I can say I'm realizing progress in integration, a more complete surrender and consecration to their work. and a more concentrated will to dream only the divine dream, be a more capable of instrument for the mother's sadhana in matter. Mental silence and peace are mostly there, and faith is being enhanced with a calm certitude. Now, the difficulty he shares, my current struggle is around the vital, which I feel de-energized after a stronger and more complete surrender. To be moved only by the divine will was established. Losing most interest in usual vital activities that moved me before, also in positive directions. Sometimes I feel just paralyzed, waiting for a bit of divine drive, clarity, direction to move. Sometimes unable to move a finger without a clear indication from my heart. My wife is a bit concerned. For example, as I stopped even some healthy sports I used to practice, and she sees it as a depressive state in some instances. Of course, I feel more bliss every day, so that's not it. Also, my interest to socialize with people is gone, and I'm very sensitive to moving from my space and atmosphere, which is my office or my cave, to others. I don't entertain the idea of the ascetic sannyasi. From the start, it was clear to me that it is incomplete and anachronistic. Some parts of my work as an architect have become tedious or impossible for the same reason. My full self is aspiring to bring the psychic being in front clearly and definitively. This is my single sphere of aspiration and prayer, but it is dragging some complications that I wish could be better integrated also as an opportunity for wideness and universality. So this being the background he has shared, the questions are, have you traversed similar periods in your path? How you proceeded? Second, how to integrate this situation to allow or receive a higher vital drive to move and act and realize a more integral vehicle for Mother's Shakti. And third, is this a classic case of inertia, laziness? Should I enforce my personal will with a whip over the paralysis? So very important, very interesting. And you saw certain elements that he has shared of his experience and his state. Going purely by that and whatever is felt in the writing itself, my first response would be, yes, it happens. Yes, perhaps many have faced this. I'm sure you will find in some of the letters on yoga compilation, uh, there are people who describe similar things. Unfortunately, in the letters on yoga, what happened was, those were days where even a photocopier did not exist. So the person who compiled them used to take some of the letters from Sri Aurobindo to the sadhakas and then separate out portions to be put in different places. Sometimes a single letter would be a response to 2 or 3 questions. So he would cut it neatly between the lines so that he could separate the pieces and put them in different parts to make his compilation. Unfortunately, with this, often the questions have been lost, or perhaps they didn't exist at that point in many cases. Nevertheless, in the letters, you will find this. If you look under the heading of the vital, difficulties of the vital, you'll find things along this direction, and mostly Sri Aurobindo's guidance there would be of great help to you. I do not refer to the current letters on yoga. It's the original letters on yoga from the centenary volumes, which have been differently structured and compiled, far superior to the current one, which is not so well structured. So this is one suggestion for you to explore. But yes, similar things do happen to everybody at some stage in the sadhana, where suddenly you may find that the enthusiasm of the vital is suddenly gone, or the drive, the passion, the energy suddenly drop, etc. Now, in your case, rather than going to a general discussion, in your case particularly, what you're experiencing is a loss of this enthusiasm in one part of the vital, but also at the same time, you find something blissful, joyous, even the sense of the consecration and the closeness to the divine presence, to the divine mother growing and deepening. And yet you have this. So it's a little confusing. Why should this be there? And you have to understand that in the sadhana, the different parts within us are not all equally involved, are not all equally engaged. And just this fact makes a huge difference. So in your case, there's a part which is experiencing this great joy, blissful, but the part of the vital which is not directly experiencing this is not participating or has not been given the chance to participate. It's not integrated with this overall aspiration that you have. Let's say at a very practical level, your physical consciousness, and this is for all of us, the physical consciousness being not so conscious, being not directly connected in the sadhana or not sufficiently awake even to consciously participate in relation to the Divine Mother, is often the resisting point for most people to begin with. And to awaken in the physical consciousness, that sense of yearning and aspiration is itself quite a challenge. But when it does happen, you can feel your body itself enthused. And often this part happens through the uh, path of the Karma Yoga or the element of Karma Yoga as it is put in context of the integral yoga. But something similar happens with the vital. And in your case, it seems as if a part of the vital, at least, is not participating. We also make this distinction that you must always look at your consciousness not only in layers, but also in connections, blending from different layers. So a higher part of the vital is enjoying this. That's what gives to it this blissful quality. But another layer of the vital is not participating. And it goes into a mode which Sri Aurobindo calls the vital going on strike. And when it goes on strike, it says, yeah, if I don't get what I want, what's the point of living? Why am I going to participate? Why would I bring in my enthusiasm and my energy to something which is not at all interesting, which is quite boring, which is contrary to what I want, etc. So very likely what you're facing is in a particular layer of the vital where it is not getting its satisfaction. The problem with the current phase is that the satisfaction got from in another part is so great that it feels as if this doesn't matter. And which would be true if the path was not an integral path. Being an integral path, this part needs to be either integrated into the sadhana so that it too joins with the enthusiasm of the other parts, or it needs to be given something which it requires now. And through that, a process of integration can be begun. So I would suggest at this point, simply observe. In that part where you feel listlessness or lack of interest or lack of energy, lack of motivation and drive, what in that part would give it motivation? What activity? Be careful, those activities may not be interesting to your higher part. As you've said, many of the tendencies and interests of the vital have faded out, but in the higher part, not in this part. In this part, still it will say, oh, this I would like to do, this I will enjoy. So you must consciously be able to disconnect from the higher part, identify in or with the part of the lower partially, and feel what is it that it wants, what is it that it needs, what is it that it even demands, and for the lack of which it goes on a strike. And then it's like you're cajoling. Often in certain layers of the vital, it corresponds to certain kinds of animal consciousness. The animals very developed and refined who live on that grade of the vital. And they're far more developed in that grade than we are in the same grade because, well, we don't give so much time and attention to developing the vital. So it's the way you would treat an animal in order to tame it, in order to draw it enthusiastically in participation with your activity, which is of a different grade. So observe what it wants, yield partially to it, give it what it needs. And at that point, you may find a resistance on your part because the higher parts will say, no, I don't want that. You're experiencing a conflict, a division in consciousness. So you'll have to lean in partially to allow this without losing that. Keep the thread of the higher part. Let this part get the movement for which it feels enthusiasm. And then in that movement, remember and feel the mother's presence, open in gratitude to her and say, ah, yes, thank you for this. Connect, build the connection. You will notice once you start doing this very quickly, that part will find its joy, that part will find some enthusiasm, not necessarily in conflict with the higher. It will say, all right, you give me this, you will get something in return from me. And a kind of a via media compromise will be quick to develop. And eventually that is used as an entry point for the higher to fill this lower also. And the lower says, yes, you know what? I can feel that joy of the connection or the opening to the mother's consciousness, even from in my layer, in my consciousness, in my activity. And with that, the purification will start, and then the activity itself will undergo a change in form. And the problem will be resolved. You'll find a far greater completeness in the joy that you're currently experiencing, and in the power of expression in your consciousness in the work you do when this integration is completed. At which point other layers might pop up once in a while and things like that. Notice also sometimes this is specific to a certain type of work or a state that you are in during a particular mode of activity. You shift the mode and the state is no more there, or it changes completely. Find your way. So sometimes you may, as you've asked this question, should you assert a personal will? Sometimes you may do that because in your higher part, you realize this is not acceptable. So you may just assert and push that part for a while. At least you may notice, for example, that not doing exercise actually is weakening something in your physical body and work done is being lost. Well, you may force it. But the forcing is not a long-term solution. It may be a temporary solution. The long-term solution will be to make this integration. So I've answered, I think, the first and second. Is this a classic case of inertia and laziness? So here's the interesting part. The question itself is coming up. Although you know it's not laziness and inertia, you're saying it's not so. And yet the question is it like that? In reality, it is both. What happens is it's not a case of laziness as you feel the higher part is actively open to an experience and is actively joyfully consecrating. But when this part goes on a strike, it gives a chance for other ranges below it to assert their laziness or hide under this strike of the vital to become lazy. Or even the fact that there is this higher joy in, let's say, higher vital or mental ranges, and there's no need to do this movement or activity, gives a chance for the laziness to creep in behind the experience, use that as a cover to justify or protect itself from question, from being found out. Which is why also your question is coming up. Although you know it's not there, and yet you feel it might be there, it's because it is there hidden behind. And once you recognize this, again, you may intervene if needed to push. But you've used the word whip with your personal will. Sometimes that becomes necessary to certain types. It may even, I will say, it will be their way. I don't recommend this. Generally speaking, it's not the way in the integral yoga. In certain extreme situations, when there's a real, let's say, strong opposition, you may want to beat it also, but you would reserve those for really extreme situations. It's not the normal thing to do. The normal thing would be rather to cajole and bring into. And I think just the fact that you recognize what's happening after this discussion will help you to be able to make a breakthrough and somehow overcome this. This is very common with people who are temperamentally more in the knowledge side than in the power side or action side of consciousness. I'm going to take another question from Zen Rain, who writes, I resonate with being more of a knowledge type. Any practical advice that you can share when it comes to developing more power, authority without shrinking? So it's typically a problem this type will face, that you feel uncomfortable with power, with strong dynamism, action, which is not under control of the higher grade of knowledge or the values that to that higher part to be aligned constantly with the divine presence or with the divine will, which is easier in the higher ranges of mind and the higher vital. You don't get that when you move into this either power or action modes. And then you feel you're compromising and you're even going contrary to your deeper and truer identity, which is more in that range. So yes, just the understanding first makes a huge difference. So for Zen, I will say this, become conscious of this. And then depending on what you want to choose, if it is power, authority, without shrinking, or whether even entering into certain kinds of action, start with small steps. Put yourself in the situation that it's required. If you have the luxury, concentrate before the action, before engaging with the role that requires some power or authority. Consciously open in your higher part as much as you can to the mother's presence, to the alignment and attunement to whatever you feel is aligned with the higher consciousness or with the divine will. Again, to whatever extent, do not aim for perfection. And then consciously let that, so to say, soak in all the way down into these other layers of the vital. all the way through the lower vital into the physical consciousness. Feel in these parts, in these layers. So I'm assuming that you're able to distinguish awareness in these gradations. If you can't, or if you're able to do partially, we'll work on that also. So often the knowledge type will live more in the mind. You're conscious of your body, but you're looking at your body as if from a higher poise. You're conscious of your vital energies or even your emotions, and you're looking at it as if from outside it. Shift into it. Feel them as you are in it. Feel the vital energies, life force within you as you are in it. Feel yourself in the body as if you are it. Shift between these levels and come back to that. Shift down through these gradations and come back to that where you are. Once you can do this, you will understand what I'm saying by being in that layer. For those who are not temperamentally in the more knowledge side and you're more in the emotion or the vital or even the physical, do the reverse. From here, try to shift in until you enter the mind awareness as thought itself. And if you can, still higher, whatever grades you're able to touch, observe. And first, building awareness in each of these layers. Becoming conscious subsequently. What layer is active? Where are you when you're engaging with a certain work? You may find, for example, that you're used to doing a certain work from a certain poise, whatever that may be. I'm generalizing now. And then when you get upset, you're still doing the same work. You don't realize you've shifted poise. Observe. Yeah, when I'm in this poise, the same work, things don't work out. There's confusion, there's conflict. I shift back up, the same work goes smoothly, conflict is reduced or even eliminated, etc. So you will notice as a second step how this state shifts with different types of work, with engaging with different types of people, and sometimes at different times of the day. When you're tired, you drop, often to a lower grade, and then the whole pattern changes. Notice what triggers. Notice how you are in a different state. Often you're so tired you can't shift back to a higher grade, which requires a little more energy. Or that high grade is tired, and so you drop to a lower grade, which has more energy. In order to continue the work, you will observe these. So first step, observe the different gradations and learn to be able to shift between them, even if briefly as an exercise. Second, you will observe how your state shifts. And then third, you will consciously be able to then open from one state lower to the higher, or from the higher, bring down that presence. So I come back to the description I was saying. You open before you start the work. You open, bring it down all the way, as much as you can, all the way, even if possible in the body's substance tissue, to the extent you feel. Having done this, it feels as if much more of you is aligned to the divine influence, to the mother's consciousness, presence, or even her will, to whatever extent. And then from there, you move into the activity. So it might be work that you do and you move into the activity from that poise. Or if it's a position of power and authority, you slowly move to exercise that position of authority. What will be helpful initially when you do this is to review at the end of the exercise, at the end of the day, at the end of the activity, you come back, review, observe what happened, notice. You can't be doing that while it's happening. Don't worry if you don't succeed. Don't worry if there's a mixture. Don't worry if something goes wrong. Complete it as best as you can and then do the analysis afterwards. Observe what went wrong, where it went wrong, what shifted, at what point you slipped in your state or lost the link, or which part kicked in instinctively rather than in alignment to the presence. Simply observe. Especially be careful, do not get into this habit of criticism. It doesn't help. Simply observe. You are starting with what you are. The starting point for everybody. There's no point criticizing. Rather observe and I will use this word, compassionately deal with these layers and different parts. Work on the integration with a lot of compassion. Oh yeah, okay, that slipped. Don't worry, we'll manage, we'll do it. So you keep a positive attitude. The moment you go into these reactions where, oh, again, it went wrong, what happened? You're separating and creating barriers and veils which prevent her working. Instead, you go into that part and say, ah, yes, I slipped here. I consciously open from here. Ask for the help. Ask for her support. Feel the presence. Enjoy that nourishment that comes with the presence. And say, well, next time, help me. You'll feel the difference happening literally day to day. And it's surprising, and it's once you've actually experienced it, you will not be surprised. But initially, it's surprising the rate at which things begin to change when you do it in this way. removing veils, allowing her action in you to do things so rapidly, to integrate, overcome, etc. So I don't know if this is enough in terms of advice, but I'm generalizing from Jose's question to Zen's question also, and you'll find it helpful, irrespective of whatever that particular situation is. I'll just close with Jose's PS question. Also, very interested in the out-of-body experience series. Have been practicing Mark's advice with a couple of short but clear experiences that are very encouraging. Have been looking for Mark's book in English. Is there a link that you could share to get it? And are you offering a space with Mark soon in India? So Mark's two books have been translated in English, are available on the deeptipublications.com website, and you can get it online there. Yes, we will have a program with Mark, most likely in early February. Dates have not been fixed yet. He will probably come sometime in late January and stay through February. So the idea is to have a program somewhere around between 5th and 15th of February. We have not fixed dates, but yes, he will be doing something. I don't know what, but we'll announce that as soon as that is clear. I think by next month we will have a clearer idea. So I come down to the theme of our discussion. Last time I had shared some of my experiences, and many of the experiences had started and related to my teacher, MP Pandit, his work, and the way he led me into certain states and certain experiences. So I have an observation from Mahesh, who writes, one of the striking memories I have of MP Panditji is his terse utterances like yes in response to a prayer or some ask, an emphatic executive statement that did not need more than a single word. It's beautifully described. Yes, in fact, this was the experience we had when he spoke in response to a question. And very often that emphatic force had the effect. It was as if a command which went and did its thing. If it was something within you, you'd feel immediately an impact. If it was a question regarding work, you'd feel in it the force that caught you and carried you into the work and even through to the completion of the work. And this is something which we all experienced in the mother when she gave a response to a question. When she was asked a question, she would simply sometimes say, yes, and with it came the full force. So we had the experience of that with Panditji. Those of us who did not have the same kind of contact with the mother earlier, we felt that happening with him. I'm going to use this as a starting point for sharing something interesting which happened in my relationship with him. I shared last time how there was a point where I was able to completely open and give myself to him. And I must again warn, it's not something I would recommend you do that with anybody. He was an exception because he was so transparent. He was so transparent that from his highest to his most material, including his physical consciousness, you felt the continuity of the mother's presence. It's very, very rare. And I can say this, I've not met anybody other than him in whom it was in this way all the time. So yes, of course, it may vary in terms of intensity, but the purity and transparency was there all the time. And I can say this because I've stayed with him in his house for more than 10 years. And I've seen this close up day and night, even sometimes interacting when he was sick, which was very rare, but still, when he was sick physically with him at night in whatever circumstances, that presence was strong down to the material physical body. And at no point ever I found anything where there was a contradiction or something which was unconnected in the actions, in the consciousness itself. So this is quite exceptional and extraordinary. And so if for us, at least when we had that kind of contact with him, we felt almost as if in this opening with him, we were meeting the mother's presence directly, transparently. He was so transparent. So what happened at some stage, what I described last time, I opened myself and there was a point where there was a complete connection that began to form in this self-giving. And it was the thing which made possible certain experiences, which I will share now. So what happened was I opened myself, and a part of my consciousness began as if to give, and in the giving began to join with him. And there's a point where willingly, consciously, it was just like that. I was obviously connecting to the mother's presence. He was there, he was the vehicle through whom it would happen. But because the advantage of him being in the physical body allowed this vibration of the mother's consciousness on a material level, it gave this possibility, which otherwise is very difficult. You can have that sometimes when you touch the samadhi, you have the physical contact, but here it was in a dynamic living vehicle. So you had that, and it was deepening, and over a few weeks, months, in the experience I've already described, where he would touch the forehead and it would open something of the inner presence and its influence, this blending and joining began to be more and more complete. And I remember at the last 1 year before he left his body, it had become so deep that sometimes I would be sitting near him. And I remember one incident where, as I was sitting near his feet, there's a mosquito that came and sat on his foot. So I was within reach. And as I would do if a mosquito sat on me, I don't go whack. I would go with a single finger and go plop, just knock it out. And so I did the same thing. I went plop, I killed it. But the moment I touched the finger, it was as if I had touched my own body. Very interesting. Very interesting experience. And that's when I realized the extent to which this identification had gone on a physical level. And it was just beautiful. So I just let it be and let it continue. But it was a bit painful when he began to prepare to withdraw. And it was clear to us about, let's say, 5 months before, even 6 months before. And one of the things which happened at that point, I was feeling very strongly, obviously it was something reflecting from his consciousness. I was feeling very strongly as if, and the way I would articulate, time is short and I have to finish many things before it's over. That's the sense it was. Time is very short, things have to be finished quickly. Obviously, he was preparing, and the winding up actually began the last birthday of his in June. From then on, it's like a decision was taken, but we felt this happening from about August about. And then it was, of course, you don't allow yourself to think that he might withdraw. There was no physical reason for it. And then it went on in this way. The interesting part was, and I'm going to share this because it'll help you to understand also how the physical body is the vehicle. About a week before, maybe 10 days before, 20 days even. So 20 days before he left his body, he cut off all contact. He stopped meeting people. And we could see at that point already the diminution of the power of the presence held in his physical vehicle was beginning to drop. A person had come after he had withdrawn from the contact. A person had come because he had met before. An exception was made and he met my teacher. And afterwards he commented, I was in a shock because all the power was gone. He was right. The process of withdrawal had begun. And at that point, I remember there was a stage where we had done the morning prayer. So every morning he would do the chanting and I would be chanting with him. And at the end of that, we would all do pranam. So I would place my head on his feet. It was always this deep presence which would flow, literally glowing nourishment, spiritual nourishment, and it would flow. And this time I put my head and it could have been just anything. There was no presence. And at that moment, and perhaps it had happened 2 or 3 days, it had already dimmed enough. At that moment, a thought formed into me. I got up and a thought formed into me, which went, how long will this continue? It's pointless. The thought formed. I was conscious that he was conscious of the thought within me. And I was conscious that he was conscious of it. It was almost embarrassing, but this was the reality and we both knew it. And that was it. So the process of withdrawal had begun, and the withdrawal of the power of the presence that he contained in his vehicle, mind, life, body, the full vehicle as an instrument, that itself had begun to, so to say, be withdrawn. So obviously, when a person like that chooses to withdraw from the body, not by old age, but by intermediate choice, it's not something which can happen just overnight flop. You don't do that. You start a process of withdrawal. And so we were feeling that sense of urgency from the point he started. And there would be long hours during that period. There would be long hours where he'd be simply sitting like that and gazing into infinity for and nothing at all. We'd never seen him that for so long. Occasionally, yes, but and it was this slow preparation of the slow withdrawal. But the interesting part was in those last particular 10, 15 days, the power itself had begun to withdraw until it was just the empty shell of the body. It's fascinating to see that. And I share this because it's an experience that helps us to understand to what extent we are a shell, we are a vehicle for the presence. And even though he was so transparent, what was left in the vehicle, which was still very much an instrument, very much transparent, still was just a shell when it was withdrawn. And so I'm coming to the point though of sharing this, that joining in consciousness made it very easy for him to infuse those kinds of experiences. When the experiences came, it was just a state, it was beautiful, it was like that. I didn't always have to give words to it, it didn't matter. Occasionally, there would be an understanding of this is what it is, or this something like this. Sometimes I didn't know. I didn't know whether it was good or bad, but it was just there. So I remember once I was cycling down the road, going from at the back of the ashram, coming home. And it had already happened a couple of times off and on, because I was with him in about 2.5 years in the state before he left. And I was coming, and suddenly it felt as if everything is unreal. The walls were like fake. Everything was fake. It was like a drama set of a cinema. And I'm looking at everything and it's fake. And I don't know what to make of it. So, and later when I read Sri Aurobindo's letters, he actually says, so there's a part in me that went like, do I have high blood pressure? It's like, this is the feeling, when you have high blood pressure, you have like sound in your ears, a kind of a ringing. I don't have the ringing, but it's like suddenly everything is disconnected. Something is weird. And actually that thought came, and I read much later in Sri Aurobindo's letters where he says, if you had an experience of Brahman consciousness and you were not ready for it, you just say, hey, what happened? I kind of got disoriented. Was it high blood pressure? And you move on, not realizing what it is. So afterwards, I went and narrated to him. I said, I was walking in, I don't know, it just happened like that. It was my routine to report to him. I just opened to him in this way. And he just kept quiet and nodded and he was serious for a while. And that was all. He didn't say anything. It's only later that I understood what these experiences were. But practically all the significant experiences which developed in life later had been imprinted in this way by him. But the ease with which he could do that was because of this deep connection that took place. And the fact that the connection had gone all the way to the physical consciousness allowed this imprinting to go all the way down to the physical, because in his consciousness he could transmit it to that extent. Now, this is the benefit of having had the physical contact. In retrospect, you will see this is the benefit that everybody had when they had access to the mother's consciousness physically. It allowed a certain transmission on a physical level, which is otherwise, well, slightly more difficult, but not difficult. Slightly more difficult because you don't have the physical contact. The closest we have today in this way of that kind of contact is when you touch, for example, the samadhi, and you can feel the tangible material vibrational of the consciousness. That's accessible. Nevertheless, it makes a difference because the tissue itself being living tissue and conscious mental living tissue, the quality of what can be transmitted is much more rich and complex. So the value of a physical instrument holding, containing, and then radiating is enormous. It does not mean that the person should be accessible to humanity to be able to touch. That's not needed. But the fact that the embodying person is materially grounded in the physical world allows certain things, certain vibrations to be radiated. And even if the person were alone in isolation, that impact would be there. And the value of that, I still do not know how to articulate, but I'm doing the best I can. The fact that there is someone physically present with a gross physical material body, but with that transparency, is important, is essential. Otherwise, well, it can do things which cannot be done otherwise. Let's put it that way. So this during this period, there was another set of experiences which I had that I would classify more in the realm of the opening to the intuition. I remember in the record of yoga, where you are in the integral yoga, the structure of the sadhana, in the first three chatushtayas, the first one being equality and peace and the foundation that comes with it, the second one being amplification of power, and the third one is where we have the siddhis, but the four of them, the four of the quartets are described by Sri Aurobindo in this way, and I read the Vijnana Chatushtaya. The first is Jnanam, which represents the divine knowledge. Second is Trikala Drishti, which is the perception of all that happens, past, present, future. Third is the Ashtasiddhi, the 8 siddhis that we have been studying so far. And the fourth is the state of Samadhi. These four together consist or create or are combining into the Vijnana Chatushtaya, the Chatushtaya of Vijnanam, which we can say supermind, supramental Chatushtaya. Now, of these four, we have dwelt on the Ashtasiddhi, but understand the four have to go together. So the first being Jnanam, divine knowledge, is the ascent into upward towards the supermind, of which the very first partial step would be tending towards intuition and the four facets of intuition. Trikala Drishti, this awareness of things past, present, future. Right now, we don't worry about the Ashtasiddhis, which we have been dwelling on the consciousness and the registration in knowledge, as well as the action in power, generally. And then the Samadhi, the state of immersion in deeper and higher ranges of consciousness, in which knowledge of states, experiences, events, forces, including of other worlds, are accessible to you. So I'm going to blend a little bit of these four into the discussion that follows. And key to that is the intuition, which comes with let's say, the first movement of Jnanam. So the Jnana itself, Sri Aurobindo says, consists of three powers: Drishti, revelation; Shruti, inspiration; Smriti, intuition, discrimination, etc. So these we will study later, but for now I'm just pointing to this because it's extremely important. When this combines with the, let's say, Trikala Drishti or Ashtasiddhi, or the immersion in Samadhi amplifies these, then all these experiences begin to grow. So the key element here is the intuition. When the intuition is lacking, take an example of somebody who's clairvoyant. So the clairvoyant person sees. So I was looking out of the window and I saw in the sky some form, let's say. What does it mean? I don't know. So what use is that vision? Isn't it? Or there was a particular suggestion, idea, image, or a knowledge which came. What does it mean? Why has it come? What am I supposed to do about it? I don't know. So eventually, you will find none of these faculties are useful or reliable because you don't know how much they are mixed, or the application of which is not certain because of lack of intuition. So in the sequence of the four, again, we will understand the intuition is critical. So the growth of intuition, and as it grows, the amplification through it of the value of all others is going to be essential. So this will be part of our later discussion. I'm anticipating, but I want to link it to certain experiences. So what had happened was early on, because I was attending my teacher's classes, he had at that point every evening he would have a class, 6:30 to 7, lecture, topic, something, sometimes a study, sometimes just he would just sit and say, well, any questions? And it would begin with that. So often he would begin in the earlier days, because he was going to see the mother, he would begin by sharing something which had come from an interaction with the mother, something she had said in response to someone's question, whatever it was. It would start with that. Later, he took up certain topics for study, but generally, it was always open to any kind of question. And I remember in those days, I was still young. It must have been, let's say, 10 when I was going regularly. I was already living in his house at that point. I would complete the evening activities of our physical education program, and I'd be yearning to get home. The moment it was over, I'd be the first out to run home, and his talk would have typically begun already because 6:30 would start on the dot, and I would go quickly from the back and sit there. And it was such a relief to be in that presence and to bask in that. Literally, it was intense furnace light presence, warmth, and love. So I'd be in that bathing, enjoying, and of course, these things would go in sometimes, understanding things how in whatever way was possible. So one of the things which had come frequently was the idea that, well, you can stop your thoughts. You should be able to have a quiet mind. So I remember this was in our class section, which is called P1, which must be about age 10. And I remember sitting, our school starts always with 5 minutes of some mother's music or Sunil's music or some recording as a way of concentration. And we would typically sit there and daydream because we didn't know better. Or people would say, close your eyes. Oh, okay, you close your eyes, but then you peek, you daydream. And one day suddenly this idea pops up and says, well, why am I doing this? Let me see if I can stop my thoughts. Because I already heard that it's possible and it's doable. Okay. I didn't know how. So with will, and suddenly you think, now the thoughts have stopped. Oh my God, there's a thought. You don't even think that your thoughts have stopped. You continue and persist. So it's pure will force stopping, which was great fun. I began to enjoy doing that. And very quickly, I found I could extend the duration even to prevent the thought coming that, oh, it's thought stopped. And I could extend, I don't remember now, maybe 15 seconds to 30 seconds. And of course, it's not the easiest way, it's not the best way, but it's good training, it's good exercise. So putting into practice in little bits some of the things I was hearing began to be, let's say, part of my spiritual journey. And some of these ideas were sometimes quite, in a way, premature, and yet, well, you start as early as you can, isn't it? Even if your understanding is not complete. It did create some difficulties. And one of the difficulties was, and I'm relating this to the questions which we started with today, to not have desire, to not have expectation. These were ideas which I had heard, and I was trying to put that into practice. One of the things it did was, it prevented the normal development of those movements of emotions and the vital drives. And every time there was a strong vital drive, you say, hey, but I don't want to have this desire. I don't want it to be driving me. I want to be in control. So the mind is constantly putting a leash on the vital instincts and impulses. In a way, it's good. But on another level, to not have learned how those things flow and the skill of working on them, that was missing. The skill of restraining them was very well developed, but the skill of wielding them had not developed. So there are advantages and disadvantages. So this I ended up having to do much later. Nevertheless, I'm explaining what happened. So very quickly, this ability to restrain, withhold, etc., became strong. Not realizing the distinction, because in my mind it had not yet been formulated, I was very quickly sliding into a more typical ascetic path. Strong knowledge, withheld desires, withheld drives, etc., which was good perhaps in one way, and later the corrections which had to come. Nevertheless, it was very useful because it built the foundation of stillness and quiet, in which again those imprints of experiences that he gave could be more quickly received. Looking back, because the time I had with him was relatively short, maybe a little over 10 years, 12 years, 12, 13 years, I would say. It was more useful that I set aside all these other issues, receive what was given, and then later deal with those issues. And so I think in the larger perspective, it was perhaps the right passage. But I'm sharing these to show you that this is possible easily at that age, and it's possible at any age. Start whenever you are. Play with these things, put it into practice. Do not aim for perfection. This is a common mistake we all make. Oh, I tried, it worked for a while, then it didn't. It was not as easy as what I read. It's never as easy as that. But could you do it for a few seconds? Yes, you could. Well, it's within your reach. Now play with it. Let it grow. Let it integrate. Don't worry if it fails after a point. Do again. Enjoy. That's why I keep using this word play. You play with those experiences and let them grow. You enjoy them. And then the integration takes place much more easily than if you're doing it with anxiety and with a certain force of will alone. So this is one of those very early openings. And what I found, what it led to very quickly was in that quietness and the familiarity with the quietness of mind that grew, the faculty of intuition began to dawn. And I found subsequently even in what I described last time about, you remember the three ideas and the third one was still coming up without being unpacked. The experience of these things often, literally you feel as if slowly entering in you, and the word dawn is very natural. It's like the morning light slowly glows and grows, increases until it fills and becomes brightness. The experiences similarly enter, slowly grow, fill, and eventually settle and stabilize. And this is the Vedic vocabulary dawning, or Usha, as the goddess of dawn, who brings the light, who brings the knowledge. And in this movement of awakening particularly comes with that power of dawn. So the intuition was beginning to dawn naturally. And with that, spontaneously, there would be suggestions, ideas. And very quickly, you realize that it's not accurate. Your expectations, your strong desires, your habits are popping up and masquerading as intuitions. Just because something popped up out of nowhere and was not part of your familiar domain does not mean it's a real intuition. You don't know where it has come from. And then sometimes it's right, so you verify, sometimes it fails, and you learn to distinguish the vibrational quality of what is more true, less true, and then what is pure and what is mixed. So in time, this thing began to grow. I had a very strong interest at that time in science, of course, that was my temperament as a scientist, but with it came the science of higher realms, so the occult and spiritual, to the extent one could understand it rationally and logically, and even the working of the spiritual forces. So I was reading a lot of things. A lot of books were coming to my teachers for review. Many of these were coming from the West, from Shambhala publications and various others that he had met, and so they would send regularly. So it was one of the entry points. At the time, we didn't have the internet. So one of the entry points for me to have a wider understanding of these experiences, but also of the scientific approach and exploration of these experiences, which had kind of started in that period. So reading one of the two books which he had in particular, which were to me of great importance. So there was one book which was called Encyclopedia of Occult Sciences, and it had everything from palmistry, astrology, mostly from a Western perspective, chiromancy, I don't remember the terms now, symbolism, uh, all kinds of things, because it's an encyclopedia. I would have probably turned pages, not read in detail, but turned pages at least cover to cover, and reading portions which I found interesting. But the question always was, well, what's the science behind? It's one thing to learn by heart a book. It's another thing to understand the underlying principles. Then you don't need to learn by heart the book. Then you can use those principles and, well, you write your own book, so to say. What was that behind? And I was constantly looking for this, which I never found in any literature, including in the Indian texts of yoga or other occult things. I never found the underlying things except eventually in Sri Aurobindo. So what happened in my case was the knowledge of Sri Aurobindo's and Mother's writings came primarily from my teacher's talks. I had not read except fragments. And I always felt something within me as if felt it was somewhat premature. All this having been, so to say, absorbed, when I finally read on my own in depth, from, so to say, going from cover to cover, so to say, in a formal way, all this knowledge was at the backdrop by which I could understand the value of certain phrases Sri Aurobindo would have. And so he will say something like, oh, and it makes possible a whole range of experiences. Well, I just had a long study of that full range of experiences, looking for the underlying principle. And he's telling you, well, this is the principle which makes possible all those experiences. Oh, wow. Isn't it beautiful? Isn't it so simple? It's so amazing. But if I didn't have that background, you read Sri Aurobindo, he says, oh, this makes possible a whole lot of experiences. Okay, so what? You don't understand what he's talking about. So it was interesting for me. It was like a broad, wide, rich, encompassing background with which I entered a seminal text, which explained that whole thing. Sometimes in a few broad strokes, a few sentences, and a whole domain of knowledge was just articulated and caught there. It was so amazing. But this made possible that. But so while I'm reading all these things, the intuition had already begun to, let's say, dawn. And again, I say none of my effort. It was purely coming from him, from the influence and the presence of the mother pushing, in everyone in the ashram. So one of the forms it took, because I was in the school years, the intelligence is working, but there's this thing behind which is feeling, is it true, is it false? So you read a text and you would feel something is not okay, something is missing. And you read something and says, wow, this is complete, this catches it. Because you're exposed to Sri Aurobindo's and Mother's writings, you feel that vibration. You read something else, it's true, interesting, but something's missing, and I can't make out what. So being exposed to this as a contradiction between the limitations of the intellect and something which is an underlying intuitive sense gave a lot of, it gave like a compass to start discriminating, to sift. I had at that point also gone through a lot of theosophical literature, again looking for the underlying science of the other realms, regions, etc. What was interesting, when I was about 12, we had the ashram librarian Medhananda. He was an exceptional man, and perhaps one day we can speak of some of his. If you read his books, you will see that he was quite an extraordinary being. In the past, he had significant roles to play even in human history. He was one of those giants, and very fine man, spoke very little, but had deep insight. And at that point, at the age of 11, 12, my mother was working in the library, and I said, I want to access certain books. I had found the books listed, and maybe it was relating to UFOs or something. But in the ashram, all those books to do with the occult are put in a category called Z. So the ashram, we follow the Dewey Decimal System for library book organization. But the Dewey Decimal is in the ranges of spiritual or religious, is what they would say, religious to spiritual, and those ranges is very shallow and narrow. It's not designed for that. So Medhananda had created his own categorization for those books. There's X, there's Y, and there is Z section. So X, I think, is religion, Y is yoga, and Z is occult. And apparently, under mother's instructions, books relating to the occult had to be kept aside, not to be given to common public. So at the age of, I don't know, 11, 12, I asked to review this, and this book is in the Z section. And exceptionally, he gave me permission to access the full Z section. And I freaked out. Of course, I went through all kinds of books there. Anything that I could find, I had glanced through. There's all kinds of junk, mixed stuff, to some very fascinating and insightful stuff. I remember at that point opening certain very fat books, which were from the theosophical tradition. And I read through, and yes, it was rich with all kinds of knowledge, but I said, but what value will it have practically? There were texts where Madame Blavatsky is describing certain events of the distant past. See, it's fascinating, but I felt It didn't mean anything. It didn't matter. It had no relevance to me now. So that field I sifted out. Then I found other texts where they were describing the subtle body and the aura. And those were, of course, fascinating and relevant. So I could go deep into those. So there's a kind of a natural intuitive discrimination acting. But the interesting part was as the intelligence was forming, with that age 12 onwards, your intellect comes into its own, the intuition was also parallelly developing. This is something which I greatly value looking back. And I believe this should be part of our educational system from the beginning. That as you develop the intellect, you also should develop the intuitional ability and constantly validate one against the other. So the intuition will validate whether the intellect has given the right response, whether the response is complete, incomplete, is there more to be pursued in that direction? And the intellect will validate what the intuition gave as a suggestion. And so the two become very powerful and complementary. So it naturally filtered into my academic space in the school. Practically, it meant I was ahead of the class in most things, and sometimes quite far ahead. So in the sciences, at least, I was several years ahead. In mathematics, I was many years ahead. The mind naturally was more mature for the age. And so often I found my time in the classes wasted. But then I would try to do what's useful. So I remember one incident where uh, one of the classes, physics, the teacher said, well, what is electricity? And by then they'd figured out that I was well ahead of others. So they would never ask me. I would just say, wait, they'll ask everybody. At the end of it, I said, okay, it's a flow of electrons. Fine, no big deal. I had already read the science books many years before. No big deal. So she was very happy. Yeah. Next year, another teacher came and again asked the same question, what is electricity? So this time, one of the boys had remembered and he said, I know, flow of electrons. Okay, so I waited. Teacher turned to me. So I went one meta level up. I said, nobody knows. We see its phenomena, we see its effects in the flow of electrons, we see its effect in heating, but nobody knows what is electricity. And the teacher goes, yes, this is the best answer. So I was playing with in the domain of ideas, and one of the things which was very easy and joyful for the mind to do was always go one meta level up. The moment you found something, and this is true, I'd already heard this from Sri Aurobindo's, from my teacher's talks, its opposite has its place. In what context is the opposite true? And then mother says, you train your mind to look at the larger synthesis. How can you now unite these in one comprehensive thought, idea, formulation, sentence? So I began to play with that. And one of the things it did was it helped to liberate the mind from any statement's limitations. You never stop with what is given. You always look for the complementary and then the larger synthesis. And the complementary to that and a larger synthesis. After a point, the mind gets used to that as a way of knowledge. The moment you get something, well, what's missing outside it? What's the truth of the opposite or the context beyond it? And then a larger principle, more essential, more essential. So this began to be very joyous working for the mind. Again, I'm pointing to all these being natural because perhaps a prior preparation was there. But these can be made a part of the domain of our education. It led to one more thing. As the years passed, still in teenage, the abstraction forced the mind now to hold. The moment you unify, you come to a level where maybe you can articulate. You go something still higher. There's a point where you cannot articulate anymore. You're holding a pure idea and you're struggling to find words because the moment you formulate into words, you're reducing it somehow. And coming to something like that, the mind felt literally bursting on the boundaries. But after a while, it became comfortable. It even found joy in being in that state. And see, now this is where the training comes, quieting of the mind, and then rising above to greater and greater, more complete idea. And if you have kind of an intuitive feel, it comes to a point where you're holding in silence a pure idea, sometimes with an intuitive insight behind, and holding and staying in that. So you see how this can be easily developed And like I said, it's happening at a teenage. It's not difficult, but you have to really pursue and enjoy it. And then very quickly you come to this point where you hold this, and this is where you're crossing the threshold of the thought process. Later, you'll find in Sri Aurobindo's description of the training for developing intuition, the four methods he gives. The fourth method is where people don't understand unless they've experienced it. You read the text and he says, you push all the faculties of your intellect to their maximum and as if cross the boundary where they cease to be an intellectual process and break through into intuitive. That's the fourth method. So other three you can all do. Fourth, if you have not had this kind of an experience, you don't know what he's talking about. And so when I read that later on, I said, wow, this is what was happening naturally. And the advantage of having done it in this way is the intellect and the intuition are integrated. Because you built bottom up. Even as the intuition was there before as two different faculties, you built until they kind of joined. And this is such a beautiful experience. And you push all the faculties in this way. So in some of my talks, if you look back at the 7 talks which I've given on intuition and developing intuition, one of the things I've given some examples of how you can do this kind of connection, particularly on the side of memory. So every time you read something new, and something new goes, wow, this is so interesting, and you feel the truth of it, you pause and become conscious of the part within you where you already knew it. Hold that. Feel this connection between the thing knowledge you've got and this part where you already knew it. And sometimes when you hold it, where you already knew it, something more unfolds. Oh yes, and there's this also, which was not written there, which you have not read. And that, and that. So the intuition is beginning to as if fill the memory. But it's already corresponds to something which is held as an intuitive memory within you. Things like that were beginning to happen spontaneously. Some of it from what I was listening from my teacher's talks, and some of it happening as a consequence of this process. And later, when I studied in Sri Aurobindo's writings, it was a confirmation, but also it allowed it to be made more complete. So I'm sharing some of these experiences because useful. They also help you understand what Sri Aurobindo describes and give you something practical that you should also begin to work on. Okay, so I had a few more, maybe I'll share one more thing. So eventually, after my teacher left his body, I asked myself, I of course, at some point, had to go through the experience of losing what he had given from excessive exteriorization in work and all that. And eventually, I found it was painful. Existence was painful when you didn't have this joy of the spiritual presence filling you. And so there's effort to recover and regain. At that point, as I slowly began to do, I had to make effort for the first time. Till then, everything was imprinted. So I began to make effort. And one of the starting points was the guidance he had given to feel the peace above the head and let that descend into you. So I had started with that. And then at some stage, don't remember what it was, somebody had a difficulty. And I said, well, okay, let me help you sort it. And I led them through a kind of a guided process. Okay, feel this now, become conscious of it, and then slowly, step by step, let it descend, etc. I led the person through that process. So this is where it reconnects with the topic which we have been studying so far of the Vyapti and Prakamya. As this was happening, I could feel, I was feeling it, and so there was a Prakamya influence already on the other person, but I could feel to what extent they were registering. So having done this a few times, I said, oh, if this can be done, it can help a person rapidly to get to an experience where I have a familiarity, it works. So then I did it in a more formal way with a few people once in a while. Maybe it would happen once in a year. I say, okay, let's see if we can do this together. And I found it worked, and I found it was a great help. At some stage when we were studying the synthesis of yoga, I had we discussed so many experiences, and suddenly began to feel uncomfortable. I said, we're talking about things which need to be felt. And it's nice you read and you say, ah, yes, it's possible. But many of these things are well within your reach. Can you do something to actually experience it? And that's when I began to play with this, so to say, experiment to see how far one could, in a similar way, help others to get into a certain experience. And that's how that work started and that exploration. What I found in time was it is very easy to transmit in a first imprint. It's not easy necessarily for the person to retain, to receive, or to retain, or to integrate. That depends on the effort they're willing to put into. But the transmission itself is quite easy. And without having formal procedure, it was just happening spontaneously in this way, the Vyapti, Prakamya processes. It was happening up to a certain stage. And then came the question, in many cases, how much should be done? To what extent? What is the value? And what I found very quickly was, and that's where this distinction became very sharp, not everybody is interested. Not everybody, even having received an experience, would say, oh, this is so valuable. I want to feel it and develop it and build on it. So, well, that was nice. And the next moment, they may turn away and just let it all fade out. It's not interesting. It was fun, it's novel, and it just passes. That's when the distinction between the sadhaka and the devotees began to suddenly sharpen. And in very quickly, I realized that there are very few people who really value, having touched, having experienced something, who will say, I want this. I also learned over time that there are people who are ready for it. But when it comes in this way, the question is it really so easy? It cannot be. And they turn away because it was too easily got. Which is very interesting. It's very surprising. And it comes from the ascetic tradition, this idea that you must put a lot of pain and struggle. And after many years, after many lives, maybe I will touch a little bit of something. No, but it's also possible for the divine to give you an experience just like that. And when it happens, then you are surprised. And maybe you don't value it. So these were certain experiences I had which helped me to understand the lack of readiness, the lack of interest even in humanity for these things. And then there were those who would simply, it would be a breakthrough and they were so ready and so yearning that in a few weeks or months they would pursue and build upon and develop, etc. Very rare. And that's when I understood also Mother's comment at some point. She said that in the ashram, there were barely a handful of people who were doing Sri Aurobindo's yoga truly. So I'm sharing this also as experiences and discoveries that over the years have grown. I'm going to look at the chat box. Mhm. Revati says, I read something very beautiful about Panditji's house. It was there that he received the love from the mother. It was on the terrace. That was an incident where Panditji was on the terrace and with Kapali Shastriya. And this was a time when the mother was going on the terrace of the main ashram building. Her room had not been built. So this is before 1960. And she would walk on the terrace with her hair open after having taken a shower. I think it was on Sundays, and she would walk in the sun to let her hair dry. And I've heard from many people, we did interviews at that time, 40 years ago, and they said it was the most beautiful vision. But Kapali Shastri would be one of those, many people would go on the terrace and be there for that glorious vision. And Kapali Shastri would be there, and once Panditji was with him, and Kapali said to him that he saw there was not the physical form of the mother merely, he saw there a column of light, column of white light. And then he turned and touched Panditji's forehead with his finger and awakened that sight just with that touch. And Panditji saw the same vision of column of white light. It's a very classic image in the yoga tradition of this column of light, which goes into infinity in all directions, both directions, up and down. It's similar to an experience that Amita Sen also had when a young girl in the ashram, you've grown up there as kids. So one day she goes to the mother and says, "Mother, is it true that you're divine? How can I know it's true?" So mother kept quiet. She didn't say anything. She called her to come again the next day. Then the next day, as soon as she arrived, before she could say anything, mother stood up with her arm like this, stood up straight from her chair, and Amita saw this column of light. Physical eyes. So yes, Panditji had that experience also. And but of course, the mother's love he experienced much more intensely, much more directly. It became a vehicle for that. So Sumana asking, what is the reason for Panditji's withdrawal when his body was in sound condition? Humanity would have benefited from his presence in the physical world. Yes, for a long time it bothered me. But what I also saw was at the same year, 3 people left their bodies. Champaklal, Dyuman, and Panditji. All 3 within a single year. And suddenly there was a vacuum in the ashram. And I see that looking back, the decline had already started in the community values, in the community life, the dilution of the spirituality and the decline of the community's spiritual life had begun. And for Panditji, it was extremely painful. He made several efforts to reverse that. But the people who were in position of power refused to act, refused to engage. They themselves were hollow. They were only administrative heads and incompetent at that point. The last of the appointed by the mother was Juman Bai. He passed away that year. And the vacuum which was left was huge. And with that, the decline accelerated. So perhaps looking back, it was a choice he made to withdraw, to not have to suffer after having seen the peak of the ashram, to have to suffer through the decline helplessly, because he tried. And you'll see the letters which he had written to try to stem the tide. He'd given very specific suggestions. So perhaps that was one of the reasons for the choice. There's also another reason, which is if you understand the rationale of how the decline itself can be used by the divine for a rebuilding, then it is sometimes more useful to let those forces free to do whatever they have to do before they can be overthrown or replaced. So I don't know. It's a bit complex. I don't have a satisfactory answer, but this is the direction I would point to. Aspire says, can the ascent to supermind and towards the intuition be had through the descent of substance of knowledge? Can we, just like how we enter the relationship with the self through the peace, can we just like that into relation with the intuitive consciousness transcending the mind? Yes, absolutely. And that is the most direct method. So I've given this example many times. The human and the dog, okay? Take this as an example. When you give a lot of love and affection to the dog, and the dog is also approaching you with love and affection, there's this bond which forms through love. See, we've been talking about Vyapti, Prakamya, Ishita, Aishwarya, and Vashita. All these, especially when there's this influence going through from one side to the other, the most powerful vehicle for that connection is love. We have spoken in some dry terms when you speak of the will, but will may be directing, but love is the content and the framework, the bond in which the unification of 2 consciousnesses takes place. And that's why the love for the mother and the mother's love, this is the vehicle by which the most direct infusion of the higher consciousness takes place within you. But once you understand that it is substance, all consciousness is substance. And I'm coming to the dog now. When the human being gives a lot of affection to the dog, you're transferring substance. And one of the things it does is it mentalizes the dog's consciousness, the dog's mind, and even the physical brain receives this infusion of mental substance. It makes the dog more mental. Now, the dog is not doing it consciously. It's the bond of love in which it happens. Now, when you do it consciously, now look at the human and the divine. When you do it consciously and you open consciously, yes, the substance is infused into you. Very important idea. Consciousness is not abstraction. Consciousness is substantial. It's a thing also. Okay. So because consciousness, awareness meets awareness, and in the awareness there's contact, it is felt as substance. That's how Sri Aurobindo explains it. So all consciousness is substance. There's substance of consciousness, and so there's substance of intuitive consciousness, which can be as if infused into you. And when it happens, your mind literally glows with the intuitive light. Sri Aurobindo and the mother used to pour this into people as much as they could receive. I'm coming to this, I'm linking it to my prior discussion. You can imprint an experience, and it happens with substance. And when that imprint takes place and the person says, oh, yes, that's interesting. Oh, or you're not ready, in the other example I gave, maybe I'm having blood pressure, I'm feeling giddy, I think I'm going to lose my balance, or I feel lightheaded, abnormal. You shake it off, you block, pushing out what came into you, you fall back to your littleness. Oh yeah, now I'm normal. That consciousness is not merely narrow substance, it's substance of consciousness, so it has substance of experience. Intuition, especially when given from above, is also wide. So your consciousness suddenly widens out, and it's very bright, clear, light, lifts you. And then you feel, oh, I don't know what's happening. So if you're not habituated, acclimatized to these experiences, you want quickly to fall back to your normal. Your system tires. The contrast of that grade with your grade is too much. And that's why the yoga is slow. Unconscious yoga of nature is slow. And the accelerated yoga also slows down because of lack of familiarity, lack of readiness, lack of willingness to change under influence of something higher. All these issues come. But yes, to the extent you're receptive, the divine can fill you with that substance. You live in the impact of that substance and that consciousness in you. If the gap is too great, it's difficult to sustain. If you have built up continuity, maybe through repeated infusions, you can stay with it. And you're actually living in an intuitivized mental consciousness still, but intuitivized. And that's when all the interesting things start happening. You look at something and say, wow, this insight, this insight. You have a downpour. If you're writing poetry, you can have easily a downpour of streaming, beautiful poetry, perfectly formed. And then as that fades, suddenly you find yourself, so to say, sinking back to your normal level. You don't have any more that luminosity, that light, and that wideness and the flow that came, and kind of fades out slowly. So you will, as the experience grows, learn to consciously open and receive. And when that happens, you learn to acclimatize your system to hold more and more and contain and build, amplify, intensify the content of it, until eventually it soaks into material substance and changes intuitivizes the physical body substance also. And that's when the link from the intuitive mind to the physical, when that completed, you will be permanently in that grade of consciousness, which has now been integrated all the way down. To the extent that some part of you is not yet integrated in it, there's two pieces, one part intuitivized, one not, and you have the conflict and the oscillation, and therefore loss of the experience. But yes, you can actually describe everything in terms of substantiality of consciousness also. And that's how it happens, in fact. It's the most rapid way by which you can receive. The guided meditation for descent of peace, which I have described, which is there in the YouTube channel, you'll find very helpful for this purpose. And I think there in that I've also given a bit of a description of how this infusion takes place. You can enter into relationship with the universal self, she's asking. Yes, because the consciousness that enters you is wide, you can open to or experience something of its wideness. But if you're receiving rest of you is not so wide, you'll experience wideness in a part and a sharp contrast in another part where you don't experience wideness. And that itself creates a little bit of a disorientation. So I'll come back to that experience, which I mentioned earlier, which I had one of those days just like that. Sometimes many of you might have had this also in passing. Suddenly everything becomes unreal. Why? Because something else is felt which is more real. And that other thing is so much more real that against that, this becomes unreal. That's the key to that experience, or similar grades of experience. Except you were not conscious of that other thing. It was there, it kind of dawned in you mildly, filled you inside out or top down. But in the other parts, your consciousness was not turned to receive that directly, it was turned to the other things. In the other parts, now suddenly everything became irrelevant, shallow, meaningless, empty, hollow, because something else was felt which was full, complete, real, self-existent. But it was felt in a part which was still subliminal or super conscious to you. So you were not fully aware of it. You were aware of the effect now in you of making everything else seem meaningless or unreal. That's what happened. See? So then bit by bit, that if you turn now, you say, oh yes, but then I'm feeling something. What am I feeling? And you suddenly realize there's this thing which is so vast, so huge, so complete that there's nothing in you which gives you a reference of that. So it's like a monkey suddenly experiencing huge, wide vision of knowledge and mind. What is this? You're stunned, you're numbed, even momentarily touched by something greater and higher. And after a while, you're tired and you need to rest, you need to go to sleep in order to assimilate. But if you have made that turn at that moment, instead of saying this is unreal, or there's something more real, more complete, if you turn to that, then you've got the point of the experience. Otherwise, you just remain with something, you get overwhelmed, and then it fades out. So yes, that is wide, but it is so wide that initially it's disconcerting. So you learn to habituate yourself to it. You learn to begin eventually through a series of infusions to live in a greater, wider, freer consciousness, and so on. That's why it takes time. The adaptation of the transition takes time. Jessica is saying trends in America are like a mass hysteria. I need to start praying more. I'm not sure what the context is. Yes, but you do find a little bit of a confusion all over the world. One of the explanations Sri Aurobindo gave about this was that as there is the pressure of the higher spiritual consciousness pushing down to manifest, the intermediate worlds, particularly of the vital, are also feeling a pressure downward to push down. They're seeping into the physical and creating this chaos and confusion also. So what you do is, from your part, you feel this, okay, there are forces of chaos, but there's also greater light which is coming through. You tune consciously to the light. You avoid this chaos. People who do not, who are unconscious or open instinctively to baser impulses, catch the chaotic energies first, and that creates the exaggeration of chaos that you see around the world. Brooke, I've had that moment. Thanks for calling that out. I've had that thought and didn't realize it was a thought. Oh, my thoughts have stopped now. Yes. It's a great fun to learn to master your thought and even at least to stop them initially and then gradually to master them. Yeah. Rampal is asking, where are Medhananda's books online? I don't know if they're online. Perhaps you can check out Narad's website or Incarnate Word. Narad's website is motherandshriaurobindo.in, and the other is Incarnate Word. Many of them have digitized some of these books. Perhaps his books are there. Otherwise, they can be purchased from in Pondicherry from our office, MP Pandit's office. Whatever books we could get of his, we have put. But I think there's an institution which has put some of them online. Look it up. So EJH is saying, I practice violin with Parshan. I'm not sure. Read and program every day. I know intuition could support me, but it's hard to keep mental silence while doing these things. Do you have a tip to cultivate it? I do think where normally I need a lot of reasoning. So, okay, I'm going to put this in the context of music. You can actually use any activity to assist the development of intuition. There are two things you will do. One is train your mind to become quiet first, and then in a quiet, you open to a higher influence. Feel the presence of the divine, of the mother, in whatever way, enter in relation with it, but in a quiet, receptive state. Okay. Second thing, you will now turn to action if the goal is expression in music or other activity. So you wait for that. In that state, you wait for the quiet, stillness, presence, force, light, influence to come through you until it begins to act in whatever movement in the play of the violin. So let's say you're holding, first you enter the state, then you take the violin and wait. And then at some point, you'll find it builds up and then you begin to play. As you begin to play, you allow your consciousness to flow in the play. Don't think of what you already know. Let the music follow. Listen to the music and let the music lead you. As you play one stroke, you might find the need or the urge or the yearning into a different movement and it pull you. And then you'll play this, and then you'll play that, and then you'll play that. And one after another, as if the notes will unfold. You'll have the sense that you are playing, and yet it's not you playing, it is that which is playing through you. But still you're aware, and you're aware in the moment of the next and the next and the next. This is one good way to start. You don't become an automaton. It's not as if your hand is going and your mind is, hey, what's happening? You're aware, you're very much in it, but you're clear that you're being led, you're being carried in the movement. It's a good, if you're used to the keyboard, you would do the same with the keyboard. If you're going to write poetry, then you'll find certain words form or first a thought or an experience dawns in you. And then you wait, and then maybe certain words begin to pop up like bubbles. Tit, tit, 1, 2, 3, 4 words pop. And then maybe a formulation of the words begins to come. Your mind is being used. Your vocabulary is being used. Your hand is being used. You don't become an automaton. You're being intuitivized in the action itself. So as the words form and you write down the words which come, and as you write down, more words form, and then another set of, and you're carried step by step. Your material will be used. When it is used, do not interfere. Stay very still and quiet. Allow it to be used. You say, yes, but some of these are my ideas. Some of these are patterns I know. Don't worry. It's just that you don't follow what you know, you follow what is unfolding. And don't worry if there are patterns which are familiar. So that would be a good way to train. But notice when you interiorize your state or turn or poise yourself higher, the intuition is clearer, purer. When you're more on the surface, it is less clear and more stuttering. So shift the poise, become very still, put it reverse. First, still yourself, shift the poise inward, upward to whatever you can, and then let it carry. Yes, Sumana is asking, in the Synthesis of Yoga, is the Intuitive Mind the chapter where Sri Aurobindo talks of the 4 methods? Yes, that is the one I'm referring to where he discusses the 4 methods. He does speak of it elsewhere also in the letters on yoga. Sometimes he will give you certain indications and guidances. In the record of yoga, we will see certain texts also. Then in the Life Divine, etc. But specifically about the 4 methods, you will find in the Synthesis of Yoga. But he's not just 4 methods arbitrarily. He gives you the rationale for the methods. Once you catch that, a similar rationale applies to everything else that follows. Sumana is asking which of the talks the intuition development is discussed. There are 7 talks. Number 65 to 71 of the Evenings with Sraddhalu series, my mother says. So it starts with higher levels of mind, and then it discusses how to develop intuition. So start from the first of that series, and then the title changes for each of the episodes, but at some point the title is also how to develop intuition. From the number, I think you'll be able to see it. Vivek says how to escape from this constant chasing of corporate jobs and material needs. In the West, we don't have a Sri Aurobindo ashram that takes care of the material needs, unfortunately. Yes and no. So 2 things you realize. If you had a Sri Aurobindo ashram and you were not serious about the sadhana, you would end up like many in the ashram. living a comfortable life and not doing anything useful in their sadhana. It's there, very large number are like that. Some have come with devotion. So they're happy with their devotion, they do their work, they have their devotion. Still not sadhana. At best, you can say it's a preparatory phase of sadhana. So what happens, unfortunately, the human nature is such, if you have things too easily, you stop making effort, you fall into a kind of an inertia. So also nature helps you by giving you the need and drive, etc. So yes, you have a problem, but this is the other side. The integral yoga itself can be put into practice wherever you are in whatever circumstances. What you may not have is the luxury of having a clear, focused state when your job is so hassling and demanding that you have to keep running in a state of tension and distraction. In such a case, I would say, if you're ready for that, change your job. Go for something that pays less if necessary, but one where you will have this comfort and possibility to focus in your life. Mostly people tend to do that at a later stage, but it's a choice you will make. Unfortunately, we've been programmed to think of first getting a lot of money. Once you start earning a lot of money, you're too busy spending a lot of money, so you have to keep earning a lot. Simplify your life. You don't need so much. And then if needed, change your job so that you have a job where you have greater freshness, comfort to be able to do what you want to do in terms of the sadhana also. And then the workspace itself can become a vehicle for the sadhana. All of us in the ashram are supposed to be working also, isn't it? So I used to work in the archives, I was programming, I was doing various things, I was teaching in the school, doing some things with repairing devices, whatever else. Many things at a time. But in principle, all of that can and should become part of your sadhana. So as such, the work is not a problem. You don't need to have financial security for that. You can be in a job, but you need to choose a job where the pressure that puts you in a state of stress and scattered distraction and overwhelms you so much that you can't even sleep normally and thereby be in a normal state to do some worthwhile sadhana, that you have to change. Don't aim for excess in financial situations, except to make a slight drop, and then it should be possible. If you're fortunate, you might be in a track which is already high paying, but also comfortable in terms of your swabhava, your temperament, and then it can be still quite easy. Aspire says, when the mind becomes intuitivized, is the intention to transcend the mind and live in the intuitive consciousness, the way to go? Yes, increasingly you will find as this transition takes place that you will live more and more from these higher ranges. I'm using my words carefully. The higher ranges need not be necessarily fully intuitive mind. Initially, it will be higher ranges where your mind touches and blends into the intuition. So instead of living purely in a reasoning, rational, superficial mind, you'll shift and you'll have an intuitivized state in the normal mind's working. We're going to discuss this a little more when we enter the topic of the intuition in this Chatushtaya. But from there, what you will notice is you will never stop using the mind. The origination of the insight will happen more and more from the intuitive, and then it will flow into the mind and formulate and articulate through the mind. Now, depending on where you are in this process, you may find you're on the edge where the mind touches intuition and the ideas come and then you articulate. Or you might find yourself living in the domain which is more intuitive. Thing is known with no words and thoughts. And then from there you move to articulate. But this continuum will always be held. You're not going to kill mind. You're not going to discard it. You're going to integrate it and make it a vehicle through which this operation will take place. And then from the intuition, which will widen more and more, become more and more deep, insightful. Instead of being mere moments of flashes, it'll be a sustained state which will widen and widen. And that is what will lift more and more towards the supermind through the what Sraddhalu is called overmind and so on. But get to this where the linkage begins. That's your key. From there, the rest of the journey will become relatively easy. This point is your entry into the real thing. Nikhil says we need to intuitivize our outer being. Is it so? Is our subtle being already intuitivized? You have ranges above mind which are already intuition. They're not linked to the mind. They're not organized. They're not trained. They're not developed. They have not been individualized. We have all planes of consciousness in us, isn't it? But we're not living in them and they're not integrated with this person who is evolving. So it's as if your part of your mind has to open to something higher and organize and blend that into the lower working. That's when you have evolved. You can snap out into an intuitive state, you can snap back. There's no evolution there. Similarly, you can go to an inner state, you can snap back. There's no evolution there. It's when the inner now begins to integrate with the outer, when the higher begins to integrate with the lower, until it infuses and recasts the lower in its own terms, and the lower becomes a vehicle for the higher. Then you have risen in your grade of consciousness. You're living from the higher, but through all this, in and through all this. Then you have evolved. Otherwise, it's not evolution. So in many of the ascetic paths, and even in the modern Vedantic tradition, the idea is you snap into self, discarding this. There's no evolution. But if you grow towards self through all the intermediate gradations, and each is integrated, then through the intuition, etc., you have an evolution and a spiritual evolution. The concept of a spiritual evolution itself does not exist if you're going to step in and out of states. And so spiritual evolution means the higher now dominates and recasts the lower in its terms. That's the way of the integral yoga. Jump to one question from Ankita is asking, any message from Panditji after his passing, your direct experience of his subtle presence? Yes, it's not only I have had, but others have had, sometimes much more than I experiences. Quite remarkable. Maybe I've shared one of the experiences here. This was somebody in Chennai. He was a doctor. He was very sick and he was, I think, on a nearly terminal state in his sickness. And then that night he had a dream in which he saw a person with spectacles with a green colored light of green torch going inside him and working inside his body to fix something. And then he woke up from the sleep and his illness was gone completely. He was cured. And he had only the memory of this person and the image. And later he saw the photograph of Panditji and he said, "Ah, yes, this was the person." So I take that as a very powerful and even a physical a representation of the work that he is doing. Not only he, others, Kapali Shastri, of Kapali Shastri, mother said he was on the edge of the higher mind. From there, his station was in the higher mind, and from there he was working. Others have taken similar stations, those who are part of mother's team of working for the evolution. There are many, I don't know enough about all of them. These are the ones that I know more closely, therefore. Yes, they're very much active. And the need, the demand of that work is enormous today because of the circumstances in the world also being what they are. Valerie is asking, how can we escape? How to escape the influence of the mental consciousness that often catches the part of intuition that takes place and distorts it? How to recognize this? That's why, remember, Sri Aurobindo's training starts with silencing the mind. As long as there's activity of the mind and intuition coming, which is already there, from the point where it comes, the activity is like noise, it blocks it out. Intuition is too still, too quiet, too pure, contrary to this chaos. So if you had to, you're in a forest, let's say, as an analogy. Okay. You're in a car, in a forest, with your windows closed, and inside your car, you're playing this very loud music. You're not going to be able to hear the forest, isn't it? So first you turn off the music. Then you slide down the windows or step out of the car. There are two steps. One is stilling, and the other is opening to the wideness of the presence. And that's when you hear the forest. And when as you listen, you pay attention. Through the hearing, your consciousness widens more and more until you begin to feel as if the whole forest is within you, or you're connected with the whole forest. And that's when you receive from the forest, the guidance of what it's doing, how it's working, etc. It's a good analogy of what you have to do. So first you learn to still your mind. And then remember, Sri Aurobindo says to be able to quiet the mind and hold it quiet for as long as you need to. These are the two requirements. Get to that. Then you will remove expectations. When you wait for a specific intuition, you have already many expectations, isn't it? So there are exercises I have recommended in those discussions. I would suggest you go through that. And once you have gone through how to remove expectation, etc., there are many methods you can use. Then maybe we can review this question. It will be more useful then. But it's doable and it's very easy to do that initially. What the problem you'll face later on is in that quiet, when the intuition comes, as it enters, your mind jumps up to catch, I got it. That ruins it, nothing more, or even that is distorted. So you have to train yourself to stay very still as it comes. Let it touch, let it settle, let it enter, and let it formulate itself. Let it unfold itself, and you remain completely still. Of course, you participate in the formulation, led by it. So there's a movement, but in the stillness, that movement is true, pure, and expressive of that. Jairam asks, Pandiji started withdrawing 6 months before leaving the body. Is withdrawing a normal phenomenon for all? And if not so, why did he withdraw voluntarily? What is the benefit? Because he decided to leave, he finished his work. Something unusual happened about 1.5 years before he left his body. I was walking in the sports ground of the ashram, and there was one person, Bishwajit, forget his surname. So he is somebody, his mother refers to him in the agenda as somebody with some occult opening, and she was using him to help people who were transitioning after death, something like that. He suddenly looked at me, called me, and said, he probably just received some flash of something. He said, MP Pandit will leave an unfinished work for you to continue. Something like that, he said. Something, I don't remember the exact words, but the idea that there would be something he would leave, which I had to continue, which he would not finish. So, as was my thing, I went home, I went to Panditji and I told him this is what he said. Panditji laughed and said, I will not leave anything unfinished. And as it happened, about 1.5 years later, so this was, I think, around November, December of the previous 1 year before, then one more November, December passed, and then March, Panditji left. So after he left, again, this Vishwajit told me, remember I told you that? Okay, but Panditji didn't leave anything unfinished. So the point was that his work was done in a way, and to have stayed on where he was no more capable of intervening to prevent the decline of circumstances, it's a choice that he took to leave at that point. Of course, they are all working from the higher realms. They will all come back. They will all reincarnate to continue the work of the sadhana at some stage when circumstances are more suited for what needs to be done after incarnation. Currently, it is easier for them to be of help from that poise to help things in this world. At some stage, they will say, okay, now it's also a fortuitous circumstance to re-engage in the sadhana in the material incarnation, and they will reincarnate, I suppose, whenever they feel that readiness. But yes, the process of gradual withdrawal is not common for all. In many cases, people automatically undergo a graded withdrawal with old age. The body becomes frail, like the analogy given is of a coconut. As it dries up, the kernel inside begins to separate more and more from the shell. From the drying up, the separation takes place. Something like that takes place because the physical vehicle becomes so insufficient that the consciousness begins to disengage more and more. And there's a point where the gap is so great that the transition takes place relatively smoothly. And by then, you've pretty much exhausted most of your desires and needs. And you say, okay, you're actually in a position where you can say, oh, I've done with my life. I have nothing more to do. I'm ready to go. And people say that at a certain point, and then that's when you find the transition takes place smoothly because it's done, and the separation is also done over a few years, normally. In an exceptional case like this, where the person leaves while the body is still very young and strong, often it is through sudden accident or sudden illness, etc. And then it's not so comfortable. In his case, because it was a conscious choice, the process of withdrawal was begun and the soul's choice. He couldn't say too much openly, overtly, but there were a series of extraordinary events. To many people, when they said, "Oh, I'll see you next time," he didn't say yes. He simply said, "You're always welcome in your own home." And he had actually stopped saying that. And there was Ayudh Puja. And on the day of Ayudh Puja, for those who might not know, it is a special occasion when we worship all instruments, sacred day. So on the Puja day, we would do a little ceremony. He would take flowers and touch things, instruments, including pen, which is an instrument, and machines. And that year, the last year when he had Puja, we did something very superficial, and then he took the flower and placed it on his own head and said, "This has been a very good instrument." So these are very clear indications that the process, a decision had been taken. And one last incident which I wanted to share. I'll come back. So there were many such things where it was clear he was winding up. He was telling people goodbye. So to say, oh yes, the last thing was about a month before he left, a very odd circumstance. He began to narrate to me the circumstances under which his teacher left, Kapali Shastriya. And we were in what we call the prayer room. He stepped across the threshold, went into his room. I was left in the prayer room. We never speak across the threshold of rooms. It's not normal. We always come into the same room. But the setting was such, I could not cross over. He would not. It was as if now there was a veil between us. He narrated in detail the circumstances in which his teacher left, including the occult part of the circumstances. He didn't need to do that. And it was as if he was preparing me for it. And that was just 1 month before he left. So there are many things like that. He couldn't, of course, say, "Hey, I'm going to go." You cannot do that. Even to himself, he cannot do that. And so it was done in such, but very distinct, very clear ways. So in such a case, especially for a spiritual person, the absorption of the things he has to take and separating from the things he leaves behind, that process of separation has to be done. It won't be through a shock of an accident. It'll be through a conscious process of this separation, which is difficult. It's painful for the whole machinery of the body also. Like I said, the emptying of it was not a very nice state. But having completed that, at some point, the transition is made. And then it uses an illness to make that last step. Or rather, the illness is a side effect of the fullness of the separation from the biology. Didi is asking, can you throw light on Yogic Sadhan edited by Uttar Yogi? Yes, we're going to take it up as part of our study of the record of yoga, but it will come a few months down. So Revati is saying, today being the occasion of Navratri, can you speak of something of the Divine Mother? Maybe we'll close with that. Vivek is saying, material needs. It's very rare that companies offer work-life balance in the IT industry in the US at least. Still looking, these corporate companies want all your dedication to the job. That's true, especially for the very high-paying ones. They want to extract the maximum from you. You may find others who share your value systems. And I believe there are some which do that. Nevertheless, it's not so much about how much time you give. If they want you to be in a creative state, they also ensure that you get enough sleep, isn't it? So now the question is, if you're well rested and if all your time is going in work, can you make the work state, the work activity, the work form itself a means of your sadhana? And I would suggest yes, in principle. Question is, how far can you go and how much of it can be? And that you would have to explore. But the key elements, you would need enough rest. Your mind should be relaxed, free, able to consciously focus. Otherwise, you cannot do any meaningful sadhana. When you could, in a very pure mechanical way or something which is very close to just a combination of karma yoga, you do the whole thing in a spirit of dedication and consecration and stops there. You can't do much more. But if you have had enough sleep and they want you to be creative, for which you need sleep, then all the rest can be done in the way we've described. And it doesn't matter what work you do. Beauty piece is saying, can you tell how to practice intuition while doing translations, especially Sri Aurobindo's? You know, Sri Aurobindo's writing is directly coming from higher poise. So if you really want to translate, you need to put yourself in a state of that experience and then articulate the translation from there. You could, of course, do a very mechanical translation. It could be quite good. But if you really want to do it well, you would want to enter something which aligns to him. So simply put yourself in stillness, silence, center, inward, upward, attune to his consciousness. And as you read, feel him, pray for, ask for that even the translation should flow from him as his writing flowed from him. And you use the reading to put yourself in alignment with him. And then since you have already your mind structure designed for translation, you now move to the translation flow from there. So you'll actually feel a movement of rising as you read, and then from there something flowing as you translate. Play with this, and you'll notice if you're increasingly in a still open state, what comes is almost spontaneously formulated more beautifully than you could. And it'll feel smooth, it'll feel like a flow. And then you know that it's coming from a poise of a higher intuition. So it doesn't matter what work you do. In principle, any activity can be turned into intuition. Even if you were just doing physical work, even if you were doing gymnastics, you were washing vessels, purely physical, let the movement itself begin from that poise. So put yourself in the correct poise, hold the stillness, feel in the instruments, in this case, the hands, arms, or the body, through which the movement will be expressed. And then wait for the intuition or the consciousness to suffuse and lead the movement, begin the movement from the poise in which you are. You don't initiate, it initiates in you. Catch this initiating transition. Once you get this, the rest will happen easily. So it's one of those keys. If you get this, the flow afterwards follows easily. Once your flow begins with your will, it's difficult to switch back to intuition. If you catch the flow with the intuition as initiating it, the rest is almost automatic. So I think that's a lot for today. I wanted to share some experiences in this way. I hope this will be helpful for you also. Next time we will continue with our topic, taking examples from Sri Aurobindo, and then a few questions also which have come. Let's take a moment to concentrate. Revati says it's the occasion of Navaratri. These are days when the battle of the Divine Mother against the forces of darkness and evil goes on for symbolically 10 days, culminating in the victory of the light over the darkness. So it's a point very symbolic of the world situation. And know that the Divine Mother is working through these circumstances. To the extent we are open, every circumstance can be used to accelerate our growth. To the extent we are closed, every circumstance is used to break our limitations, to open, to awaken, to bring us into some form of conscious awareness of what needs to be done. But I would start with all of us being already reasonably open. Well, consciously open yourself to her working in you. Hold this idea always in you. Ask her consciously that her will should act in you directly. It's already working indirectly through circumstances and therefore laborious, long, sometimes painful process. You open yourself and ask her to work directly in you. And whatever within you may offer resistance or opposition, you consciously relax and open and say, here also you felt, here also you work. So you ask that she work in you directly. And second, she work through you in the world circumstances directly. You may not know how, it's not your concern, but whatever she has to do in the world, she works through you directly. Again, it's happening indirectly. That's the slow, laborious evolution. Ask that she work through you directly. So consciously open yourself in love, in self-giving, and ask her to fill you with her force, with her presence, and act in you. Let her will act in you directly. and let her will work through you directly, more and more. The key thing which makes this bond complete, intimate, deep, is love. Your love in self-giving, her love that fills you and melts all the resistance in you to transform you. So start with your love, giving and receiving her love. That's the best beginning, and we can concentrate in this aspiration. We pray for the victory of the Divine Mother within us, around us, in our circumstances, and in the world, everywhere. Victory to the Divine Mother. Vande Mataram.